The air was heavy with the choking stench of smoke, and the night sky glowed an ominous orange as flames clawed hungrily at the wooden frame of a modest suburban house. It wasn't just a fire. It was an inferno, consuming everything in its path with terrifying speed. The panicked cries of neighbors mixed with the distant wail of approaching sirens. But time was slipping away far too quickly. Among the chaos, a single figure moved with unexpected determination. A dog. Small, scruffy, and unassuming. It darted through the growing crowd, its eyes locked on the blazing house as though it understood the urgency of the moment. "No! Stop it!" a woman cried, her outstretched hands unable to halt the dog's dash toward the flames. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the onlookers as the dog disappeared into the burning structure. What could possibly drive an animal into a death trap that even humans dared not approach? The moments stretched unbearably. All eyes were glued to the house, the flames crackling louder with each passing second. For some, it felt like the dog's fate was sealed. But then, movement. Through the thick veil of smoke, a figure emerged. The dog, its fur singed and its eyes wide with resolve, reappeared. But it wasn't alone. In its jaws was something no one could have predicted. Something so profoundly heart-stopping that it silenced the crowd. What the dog carried out of that burning house would redefine the meaning of bravery and devotion. It wasn't just an act of instinct. It was a moment that would leave everyone questioning how much we truly understand about the hearts of animals. And this was only the beginning. The crackle of flames echoed in the night, a haunting rhythm that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly urgency. The air was thick with heat, oppressive and suffocating, carrying the acrid scent of burning wood and fabric. Shadows from the fire danced wildly across the pavement, creating distorted shapes that flickered like ghostly apparitions in the chaotic glow. Neighbors huddled together at a safe distance, their faces painted with fear and helplessness. Some whispered prayers under their breath, while others stood frozen, transfixed by the horrific sight of the house being devoured by the inferno. A child clung to her mother's leg, sobbing softly, her tears lost in the chaos around her. Inside the house, unseen but deeply felt, the fire roared like a living beast, its insatiable hunger driving it to consume every corner. The occasional groan of collapsing would punctuate the scene, a grim reminder that the structure was moments away from complete destruction. And yet, amidst this chaos, one question hung heavy in the air. Why had the dog gone in? For those standing outside, the scene was suffused with a dreadful uncertainty. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to reconcile what they had just witnessed. "Did you see it?" a man muttered, his voice trembling. "The dog. It just ran straight in. Why would it do that?" another whispered, shaking his head. Near the edge of the crowd, the dog's owner, Sarah, stood trembling, her fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. She fought the urge to scream, to call out for her beloved pet, knowing her voice would be swallowed by the roaring flames. "Please, come back," she pleaded silently. "Whatever you're doing in there, just come back." The fire surged again, brighter and louder, as though answering her thoughts with its own relentless power. In that moment, hope flickered dimly, overshadowed by the relentless grip of dread that held everyone captive. Sarah had always been a fiercely independent woman, known among her small-town neighbors as the one you could rely on in times of crisis. A local veterinarian with a deep love for animals, she had a way of connecting with creatures big and small. But despite her outward strength, Sarah carried a quiet pain, a wound that never seemed to heal. Years ago, she had lost her husband in a tragic car accident, leaving her to navigate life alone. Her only solace came in the form of Buddy, a golden retriever with soulful eyes and an uncanny ability to sense her emotions. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was her family, her protector, and her closest companion in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. Buddy had been with Sarah through it all. The sleepless nights filled with tears, the lonely mornings when the house felt too quiet, and the moments when she thought she couldn't take another step forward. He had a way of grounding her, of reminding her that life, though fragile, was still worth living. That night, as the fire raged, Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She had been the one to let Buddy out into the yard just moments before the fire started. She'd been preoccupied with a stack of medical reports, too distracted to notice the faint scent of smoke creeping into the house. By the time she realized something was wrong, the flames had already taken hold, and then Buddy had vanished. At first, she thought he had run away in fear, but when she saw him dart back into the burning house, her heart sank. She had screamed his name, her voice raw and desperate, but Buddy didn't hesitate. He had disappeared through the doorway like a soldier on a mission, leaving Sarah and the gathered neighbors in stunned silence. The small crowd outside the house was a mix of familiar faces. Mr. Hargrove, the elderly man who lived next door, shuffled nervously, muttering something about calling the fire department again. Emily, a teenager from down the street, stood with her phone, live streaming the scene with wide, terrified eyes. Even Sheriff Daniels had arrived, his weathered face grim as he tried to keep people at a safe distance. "Sarah," he said, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, "you have to stay back. It's too dangerous." "I can't just stand here," Sarah replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "He's in there, Sheriff. He's all I have." Sheriff Daniels frowned, his gaze softening. He knew Sarah's story, as did everyone in the town. She wasn't just fighting to save a dog. She was fighting to save the last piece of her heart. Buddy, meanwhile, wasn't just any dog. He had been trained as a therapy animal before Sarah adopted him, his instincts sharp and his loyalty unshakable. Over the years, Sarah had seen him do things that seemed almost miraculous. Calming a panicked horse, guiding a lost child back to safety, even alerting her to a sick animal's distress when no one else noticed. Now, as she stood helplessly watching the flames, she couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy had gone back inside for a reason. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't afraid of fire. If he had run into that house, it was because something or someone needed him. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she whispered to herself, "Please, Buddy, come back to me." The firelight cast flickering shadows on the faces of the bystanders, each of them grappling with their own mix of fear and fascination. For some, Buddy's act was a testament to the bond between humans and animals. For others, it was a tragic moment in the making. As minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, Sarah's thoughts turned inward. She remembered the day she met Buddy at the shelter, his wagging tail and hopeful eyes standing out among the other dogs. She'd felt an instant connection, as though he were meant to be hers. He had saved her in so many ways, filling a void that no one else could. Now, as the fire consumed her home and her heart teetered on the edge of breaking, Sarah could only hope that Buddy's courage would somehow lead to a miracle. The fire was a beast of its own. It raged and crackled with a life of its own, a living entity that seemed determined to destroy everything it touched. The heat emanated from the house like a wave, forcing Sarah to take a step back as the flames reached higher and higher. But her gaze never left the burning structure. Her heart ached with every passing second, wondering where Buddy was and what he was doing in there. "Sarah," Sheriff Daniels' voice broke through her thoughts. He stood beside her, his face lined with worry. "We have to get you to safety. We'll figure this out, but you can't help him from here." Sarah shook her head fiercely. "No, I'm not going anywhere. Buddy's in there, Sheriff. He needs me. He needs someone." The sheriff looked around, catching the eyes of a few of the neighbors who had gathered on the street. The fire department was on its way, but the situation was getting worse by the second. There was no telling how long the house would stand. But Sarah's mind was a cyclone, swirling with thoughts and fears. Buddy had been in the house for longer than any dog should have been able to survive in such an inferno. And yet, he had never been just any dog. He had survived a car accident 2 years ago, an accident that left him with a broken leg and a dislocated shoulder. It had been a miracle that he had pulled through. Perhaps this was another miracle waiting to happen. She clung to that belief, unable to let go. As the fire raged, Sarah began to question everything. The fire had started so suddenly, and no one had seen how or why it began. No faulty wiring had been found, no candle left burning. It was as if the fire had materialized out of thin air, a malignant force determined to take her home, her memories, and, most importantly, Buddy. A sudden loud crash brought Sarah's attention back to the house. She turned her head toward the sound, her eyes wide. A large piece of the roof collapsed inward, sending a cloud of thick smoke and sparks into the air. Her stomach churned with nausea, and her hands trembled. The fire had already breached the upper floors, and now the structure itself seemed to be caving in. "Buddy," she whispered through clenched teeth, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Please be safe." Sheriff Daniels, seeing her distress, placed a gentle but firm hand on her arm. "Sarah, we've done all we can here. We have to think about your safety too. The fire department is on the way, and they'll handle this. We're gonna get Buddy out, but we can't do it like this. We have to wait for them." But waiting was the hardest part. Every minute felt like a year. Every crackle of the flames, every shudder of the walls, sent Sarah's heart plummeting. She could feel the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. Had she made a mistake by sending Buddy back in? Should she have waited for help? Was it her fault that he was in there? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint but unmistakable sound, the soft thud of paws on the ground. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she whipped her head around. There, emerging from the smoke, was a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. Buddy. But he wasn't alone. The dog staggered out of the house, his golden fur singed in places, his body coated in soot. He was limping heavily, his breathing labored, but his eyes, his soulful, intelligent eyes, were locked on Sarah's. In his mouth he carried something small and fragile, held gently in his teeth. "Buddy!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with both relief and fear. She rushed toward him, her heart in her throat. But as she neared him, she saw that he was struggling. His body trembled under the weight of whatever he carried, and his legs wobbled as if he might collapse at any moment. "Come on, Buddy," Sarah urged, her voice barely a whisper now. She bent down to him, her hands trembling as she reached for the small bundle he was holding. At first, she thought it was a piece of cloth, but as she took it from Buddy's mouth, she realized with a start that it was much more than that. It was a bundle of old photographs, some charred at the edges, others still relatively intact. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the faces of her parents, her childhood friends, and moments from her life she had almost forgotten. This is... Her voice trailed off in disbelief. Buddy collapsed to the ground beside her, his body finally giving way to exhaustion. His legs buckled, and he let out a soft whimper of pain. "Buddy! No! Please stay with me," Sarah cried, her hands gently caressing his head, trying to keep him awake. She glanced up, searching for someone, anyone to help. Sheriff Daniels was by her side in an instant, kneeling next to her and checking on the dog. "He's going to be okay," he reassured her, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. The sheriff's experience told him that Buddy had been through more than any dog should have to endure. But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the bundle of photographs in her hands. Something about them, the way they had survived the inferno, untouched by the flames in certain spots, stirred a feeling deep in her chest. These photographs were far more than just pieces of her past. They were a link to something hidden, something important. As the fire department arrived and began to battle the blaze, Sarah held the photographs close, a strange sense of urgency gripping her. There was a mystery here, something beyond the flames. She had to find out what it was. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I need to know how this fire started. I need to understand what Buddy found in there." Sheriff Daniels glanced at her, his face conflicted. "You're not making sense, Sarah. The fire department's already investigating. You don't have to worry about that right now." But Sarah could feel it. In the pit of her stomach, she felt the unmistakable tug of something unresolved. This fire wasn't just an accident. It was too purposeful, too strange to have been random. As the days passed, Sarah's obsession with the photographs grew. She pored over them, piecing together the fragments of her past and wondering why Buddy had brought them back from the fire. There was something about the images that unsettled her, a connection she couldn't quite place. Each photograph seemed to hold a clue, a memory buried so deep it had been forgotten. But as she stared at the pictures, her mind raced, and a troubling thought began to take root. What if Buddy had brought them out for a reason? What if the fire wasn't the end, but the beginning of something much bigger? The mysteries surrounding her life were just beginning to unravel. And as the investigation into the fire continued, Sarah found herself on a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her past, her home, and even the dog that had saved her life. The days following the fire were a blur of unanswered questions and half-formed thoughts. Sarah had a sense of unease that gnawed at her, a persistent feeling that something important was hidden beneath the surface of everything she was experiencing. She couldn't shake the image of Buddy's eyes, his gaze locked on her as he staggered out of the burning house, carrying those photographs. Despite the assurances from the fire department and Sheriff Daniels, something didn't sit right with her. Buddy had always been a loyal dog, but this felt different. He wasn't just saving her memories. He was trying to tell her something, and she couldn't figure out what. One evening, just after dusk, Sarah sat in her living room with the photographs spread out before her. The flames had consumed the edges of some, leaving them blackened and warped, but others remained intact. She had been staring at the same photo for what felt like hours, a picture of her family, taken on the porch of this very house. But in the background, barely noticeable, was something odd. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a strange shadow cast by a passing cloud or the angle of the camera. But as she squinted, she could see it more clearly. A figure standing just outside the frame. A shadowy shape, too tall to be anyone she recognized, too unsettling to ignore. Her pulse quickened. Who is that?" she muttered to herself. There was a knock on the door, pulling her from her thoughts. Sarah jumped, her heart racing as she rushed to answer. Sheriff Daniels stood on the porch, his face drawn and serious. "We need to talk," he said, his tone lower than usual. Sarah stepped back, allowing him inside, but her mind was still focused on the photograph. The figure, the shadow. It was like a bad memory trying to claw its way back to the surface. "Sheriff, I've been looking at these photos," she said, her voice tight. "There's something in the background of one of them, something I didn't notice before." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Sarah, we've been over all this. The fire's under investigation, but I think you're looking for answers that just aren't there." "But there is something there," she insisted. "I need you to look." She handed him the photo, and he stared at it for a long moment. The sheriff's face was unreadable, but Sarah saw his eyes flicker to the shadow in the background. "I don't know what to tell you," Daniel said, handing it back to her. "You're probably just seeing things. The mind plays tricks when you're under stress." Sarah's frustration flared. "This isn't stress. This is something real." She could feel her breath quickening, her palms starting to sweat. "Why won't anyone listen to me?" Daniels paused for a moment, his expression softening. "I'm listening, Sarah. I really am. But I need you to trust me here. We'll get to the bottom of it." His words didn't settle her nerves. Instead, they only deepened her suspicion. She could feel that the sheriff was hiding something, or at the very least, downplaying the gravity of the situation. He was supposed to be a man of action, of facts, but something about the way he avoided looking at her directly made Sarah uneasy. After he left, Sarah's unease grew. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, too empty. The wind outside howled, pushing against the windows like some unseen force trying to break through. The shadows seemed to dance, alive with something she couldn't explain. She sat up in bed, staring into the darkness, wondering if she was losing her mind. The image of the shadow in the photograph lingered in her thoughts like a dark cloud, refusing to let her go. A sudden scratching noise at the window jolted her upright. Her heart leaped into her throat as she hurriedly turned on the lamp beside her bed. The light flickered for a moment before settling into a steady glow. The scratching continued. It was slow at first, a faint tap against the glass. Sarah's breath caught in her chest as she stood and approached the window. Her hand hesitated over the blinds, her pulse pounding in her ears. Slowly, she pulled the blinds aside, revealing nothing but the empty yard. The wind howled, the branches of the tree outside scraping against the glass. She let out a relieved sigh, but then, a shadow. At the edge of her yard, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Her heart stopped. The figure was tall, just like the one in the photograph, its form hidden beneath a dark cloak, the shape too indistinct to make out any features. The moment stretched, time slowing as Sarah stared, her chest tight with fear. Then, as if sensing her gaze, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, as if the sight of it had paralyzed her. Slowly, the air around her felt thicker, suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking her out of her trance. She snatched it up, desperate for any distraction. It was a message from Sheriff Daniels. "Sarah, I need to speak with you urgently. Something has come up. Please don't go anywhere." Her fingers shook as she typed a response. "What's going on? Did you find something?" There was no immediate reply. The seconds stretched into minutes. She waited, but the text went unanswered. A loud thud from the kitchen made her jump. She shot up from the bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She tiptoed down the hallway, the air growing colder with every step. When she reached the kitchen, her breath caught in her throat. The door to the basement was ajar. Sarah's first instinct was to call out, to yell for someone, anyone, to help, but the words stuck in her throat. The house was still, eerily still, save for the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She knew Buddy was upstairs in her room, curled up on the bed, still recovering from his injuries, but something told her she wasn't alone. She slowly stepped forward, the beam of her flashlight casting long shadows across the room. Every step felt like it echoed through the silence. She reached the basement door and paused. The scratching sound again, louder this time, more deliberate. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the handle and pulled the door open, her breath catching in her throat. The air was cold, and the stairs leading down into the basement seemed to stretch into an abyss. A faint light flickered from below, casting strange, jittery shadows against the walls. Her heart raced, but her feet carried her forward. She had to know. The second she set foot on the first step, a cold chill washed over her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The light flickered again, and then everything went dark. The basement door slammed shut behind Sarah, plunging her into darkness. Her heart raced, and she instinctively reached for the flashlight at her side. But before she could turn it on, a low groan echoed from the depths of the basement. It was like a voice, a guttural, whispering moan that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. She froze, her breathing shallow, caught between the pull of fear and the need to find answers. Suddenly, a faint, flickering light appeared below, casting long shadows that danced across the wooden beams. It was coming from the far corner of the basement. Sarah's pulse pounded as she forced her feet to move, one step at a time, her eyes locked on the shifting light. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could feel the chill seeping into her bones. She wasn't sure what she was walking toward, but the pull of the unknown was overwhelming. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused. The room before her was eerily silent. There, in the far corner, she saw it. An old chest, cracked and worn, surrounded by old crates and boxes. The light was coming from within it. A soft, eerie glow emanated from the chest, illuminating the dark, dusty basement. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but she knew that whatever was inside the chest had something to do with the fire, with Buddy, with the shadow she'd seen in the photograph, with everything that had happened in the last few days. Steeling herself, Sarah approached the chest. Her hands trembled as she reached for the rusted latch. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, a sharp bark echoed through the basement. It was Buddy. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she whipped around. Buddy was at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide and frantic, his body tense. He was staring directly at her, but there was something different about him now. His usual loyalty and playfulness had been replaced by a strange, desperate urgency. "Buddy," she whispered, taking a step back, confused by the emotion in his eyes. "What's going on? What's in that chest?" But Buddy didn't answer. He just stared, his gaze pleading. Suddenly, the light in the chest flickered, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw a figure, tall and shadowy, looming inside the glow. Her breath caught in her chest. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the basement and never look back. But she couldn't. She had to know the truth. With a deep breath, she snapped the latch open. The chest creaked, its lid rising slowly, and as it did, a cold wind rushed out, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. The room seemed to darken, the light from the chest fading. She could barely make out what was inside, but there was something unmistakable. A stack of old, yellowed papers, their edges curling with age. She reached for them, her fingers brushing the delicate paper. As soon as she touched it, a rush of memories flooded her mind, images of her parents, of childhood moments she had long since buried. The photographs, the house, and most unsettling of all, the shadow. She had seen this image before. Suddenly, the air shifted, and everything changed. The walls seemed to pulse, the room alive with an unnatural energy. The light flickered and Sarah's head spun. She felt as though she were being pulled into another world, another time. Her hand gripped the stack of papers tightly, and when she looked up, the shadowy figure from the photograph was standing before her. It was real. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, but its presence was unmistakable. It had been watching her, following her, and now it was here in the basement. Buddy's bark cut through the tension, and Sarah spun around to see him charge down the stairs. His teeth bared, his body tense, as if ready to protect her. The shadow seemed to hesitate, its form shifting like smoke, but Buddy was relentless. With a ferocious growl, he lunged at the figure, but as soon as he made contact, the shadow seemed to dissipate, melting into the air like mist. Buddy paused, panting, his eyes wide in confusion. "Buddy, what is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She was no longer sure if she was awake or trapped in some waking nightmare. She clutched the stack of papers to her chest, her fingers numb. The room was still, the only sound now the pounding of her heart. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered to life in her hand. Sarah's eyes shot down to the beam of light, which illuminated the photograph she had found in the chest. It was an image of her parents, young and full of life, standing in front of the house. But behind them, in the background, the shadowy figure was there, lurking, its form more solid than before. As Sarah stared at the photo, a wave of realization hit her. She wasn't just dealing with the past. This wasn't just about the fire or the strange occurrences. The figure, the shadow, it had been with her family for years, hiding in the background of their lives. She had never seen it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The shadow had always been there, a presence she couldn't explain. It wasn't until now, when it had tried to destroy everything she held dear, that she realized its true purpose. It had been feeding on her family's history, their memories, their fear, and now it was trying to claim her as its next victim. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah had been chosen. She wasn't just a bystander in this dark tale. She was the next target. And Buddy, her loyal dog, had known it all along. Buddy had saved her life by bringing the photos to her, by protecting her from the shadow. He wasn't just a dog. He was her guardian, sent to guide her through the darkness. With newfound strength, Sarah stepped forward, her gaze locked on the photo in her hands. The shadow may have thought it had one, but she wouldn't let it. She wouldn't let it destroy her family's legacy. "I won't let you take anything more," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. And with that, Sarah ripped the photograph in half. The moment the paper tore, the air shifted. The shadow let out a chilling wail, a sound so bone-chilling it felt like the ground itself was shaking beneath her feet. The chest burst open, the old papers flapping in the sudden wind, as if trying to escape. The lights flickered violently, and then, just as quickly as it had come, the shadow was gone. sucked back into the void from which it had emerged. The basement fell silent. Sarah stood there, panting, her heart racing. The room was still, but the weight in the air had lifted. Buddy, still at her side, nuzzled her leg, his fur soft and warm against her trembling body. It was over, but the cost had been high. Sarah's family's history had been buried beneath layers of darkness, hidden by the shadow that had fed off their fear. Now, she was left to piece together the fragments of the life that had once been. As she climbed back up the stairs, Buddy at her side, she knew that some questions would remain unanswered. The shadow was gone, but the scars of its presence would never truly fade. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, but Sarah understood the truth. Some things were better left forgotten. Some memories were better left untouched. And as she stepped out into the light of the morning sun, she realized that her journey wasn't just about fighting shadows. It was about surviving them and learning how to move forward no matter how heavy the past might be. As Sarah stood on the porch, the first rays of the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The storm had passed, and the house, once filled with secrets and darkness, felt strangely peaceful. The air was still, as if the weight that had been pressing down on it had finally lifted. Buddy sat beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah could breathe. The battle was over, but she wasn't sure if the scars of the past would ever truly fade. The shadow had been defeated, but it had left its mark, not just on the house, but on her heart. She could still feel its presence, like a lingering whisper in the back of her mind. But there was something else too, a quiet sense of relief, of victory. She had faced the darkness head-on and come out on the other side stronger. Her thoughts drifted back to the chest in the basement, the photo she had torn in half, and the unsettling realization that this was all part of a much bigger story, one that had spanned generations. Her family's history had been tainted by the shadow, and yet, she had been the one to end its hold. It was almost as if she had been chosen for this, destined to uncover the truth, even if that truth was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. But now that the shadow was gone, Sarah knew that it was time to move on. She couldn't keep clinging to the past, to memories of fear and darkness. She had to let go. She looked down at Buddy, his eyes soft and trusting. He had been her protector, her guide. It was as though he had known all along what she was capable of, even when she didn't. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forged in the heat of battle and sealed with love. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Buddy's tail wagged in response, a simple act of love and loyalty that spoke volumes. Sarah smiled softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The past had been dark and filled with unanswered questions, but now she could finally look forward. The shadow had taught her something, too. It wasn't just about fighting evil or confronting fear, it was about survival. It was about facing the darkest parts of ourselves, acknowledging them, and then choosing to move forward. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't the ones we fought against others, but the ones we fought within ourselves. And Sarah had fought with everything she had. As the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Sarah turned her gaze toward the horizon. There would be more challenges ahead, more questions to answer, but she was ready. She had been through the fire and come out stronger. The past might never fully leave her, but she had the power to shape her future. Whatever comes next, she thought, I'll be ready. And with that, she stepped forward, leaving the shadows behind her, knowing that as long as she had Buddy by her side, she would never have to face them alone. The darkness was gone, but the light had returned, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. If you enjoyed this heart-pounding journey and want to hear more thrilling stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling content. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about Buddy's incredible courage? And how do you think Sarah's story will unfold next? Drop your predictions and thoughts in the comments below. And remember, the darkness might have been defeated, but there are more mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. Stay tuned for upcoming videos that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join our community of mystery lovers, and let's explore these untold stories together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.